Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Lovely to have you with us today. I'm genuinely excited about today's webinar. Like, really, I've been looking forward to this since we were discussing it a couple of weeks back as a team. It's like what we're going to talk about. And really, it's one of those things I find like super fascinating because there's so many different angles to it. There's a cast of characters, and it's really, really fantastic to sort of like get into with the smartest people in the industry. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Nick. I'm the Chief Intelligence Officer at Crystal. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Hannah, Irina, if you'd like to introduce yourselves.
Hey, I'm Hannah Curtis. I lead our Crystal Foresight product, which is a stablecoin market intelligence tool.
Hello, everyone. Here at Crystal, I'm leading compliance initiative and as well having experience in sanction management. So happy to have you all today.
Hannah, Irina, it's really great to sort of talk today. Just for those of you who are in the session now, there are going to be some interactive polls that come up. If you please leave your feedback, this helps us out a lot with understanding the sort of people who are interested in this kind of content, so we can make sure we're more tailored and understand what people are interested in. And also, your interaction is great. If you do have any questions or comments, please leave them in the chat. That's absolutely fine. We'll try and come to your questions if you leave them. We might address your comments if we have time. But I think it's going to be a pretty packed session today because there's so much to get through with this topic. Just before we proceed, there is something on the slide here. As we're saying, the session is recorded and we may share it for information marketing purposes. So if you do ask a question, just bear that in mind. Please don't use any AI or note-taking or transcription tools. We will share versions of this afterwards recordings for people who subscribe to us. That's fine. Um, Similarly, we encourage open, robust discussion. Statements made by ourselves may not represent Crystal's own opinions or positions, although we are obviously very qualified people in our fields, they're still our own opinions. And nothing within the presentation today can be considered as legal, compliance, financial investment advice. And that's really important to say because we will talk about sanctions and some of the practical implementations around this. Enough of that. Let's get on to talk about A7, A5. First off, what is A7, A5? A7A5, just to set a bit of context, and I'm sure you know, that's why you're here, but it's a ruble peg stablecoin at the center of what many people, investigators, described as a Russia-linked sanctions evasion network. Um, Basically, it has kind of like its roots in 2024, where the first tokens were issued in December, but it's sort of like proper launch was on the Ethereum and Tron blockchains in February 2025. Very quickly afterwards, this obviously raised alarms around regulators, particularly in Western jurisdictions, so US and Europe and the UK. And very quickly, A7, A5 LLC, or A7, the token issue itself, was sanctioned by the UK and almost in sequence afterwards, the EU. Um, the UK did it on the 30th of April, and the US Treasury finally moved in August. So within that sort of like 4 or 5 month period, it actually went under fairly comprehensive sanctions in whatever else. There are loads of numbers around this, and I think it's fantastic we've got Hannah to talk to us today as a real, bona fide economist who can talk about this stuff and maybe see things different from a threat finance perspective, as perhaps some of you might be previously. So A705 comes out, lots of fanfare, lots of discussions around it. The general scheme of what A7, A5 is a ruble-backed stablecoin. It's issued by a company called Old Vector in Kyrgyzstan. It's co-owned by a Moldovan Russian oligarch called Ilan Shor and the Russian State Defense Bank, PSB. And the idea is that inside a bank held inside Kyrgyzstan, there is a one-to-one with an A7A5 token and a ruble deposit within the bank itself, just as you would find with other major fiat-backed, stable coins. Um, it has all the same characteristics as a normal stable coin, except it's just a ruble-backed one. However, lots of things have happened with it since it's sort of turned up. Obviously, the sanctions is one thing. We have bits and pieces coming in and out, and then lots of investigations start appearing later in 2026. Even as recently as the 10th of August, I think that was Monday, PSB's bank, Peter Fradkov, turned around and said that actually, it had done huge amounts of transactions, still $140 billion of turnover. And we'll have a look at those numbers because we have the data to look at it. One of the fantastic things about blockchain. So I just want to talk quickly about who some of the characters are behind this, because there are certainly a cast of individuals that really made A7 stand out, or A7, A5 stand out as a particular thing. Principally is this chap called Ilan Shor. He is a convicted fugitive Moldovan. He was involved, or widely believed to be involved in a bank fraud, or the missing $1 billion from a bank that he managed in Moldova in 2014. Several $1 billion from other banks also went missing around the same time, caused a huge crisis inside the Moldovan government, inside the financial sector, leading to a bailout. And he's widely believed to have been a Kremlin intermediary trying to exert influence for Russia inside Moldova specifically, including funding political parties, dissents, and various other things. We have some other sort of like more backseat figures. Petr Fradkov, who's the CEO of Promisbank, who obviously runs A705's ruble reserves, holds it. He's also very well connected and connected to the SVR chiefs, that's Russian intelligence services. We've got Oleg Yenko, who is the public face of A705, who pitches the legality of Kyrgyzstan as non-Russian and obviously offers this huge yield of 13%. We've got Leonid Shumakov, who's the project director, who has the old Vector relationship, but also the distributing area Grinex, as well as linking to PSB. And finally, this chap called Sergei Mendeleev, who is very strongly connected with Garantex. He's been a very public figure involved in Garantex, but he also had a strong tie into Grinex. So Mendeleev is a very sort of like colorful character. He's also very vocal on social media. He's very critical of particularly Western things. He put out a statement around the time of his own sanctioning, basically saying, we don't care. The more they put on the lists, the less attention they'll pay to those who are actually doing something. So bring on more sanction, we don't care. In fact, in more recent times with the EU 20th package of sanctions, he turned around and basically criticized London and made some pretty, I mean, I would construe as racist comments as well about, you know, the UK and its region there. So A705 goes through all these sort of like cycles, and one of the key sort of turning points we'll talk about is its sort of rapid devaluation, its rapid sort of cessation of activity. And the main sort of area that happened was this thing around an event called Grinex. So there weren't huge amounts of vendors to go and redeem your A705 back into rubles. Like you couldn't take it anywhere and spend it. And ruble still doesn't have the strength of like a dollar-backed currency to be redeemable as a dollar value. It's still a ruble. People still ultimately want a harder currency like a dollar or a sterling or a euro. So there are only a handful of venues where you can take your A785 tokens. One of them was Grinex, and Grinex was hacked in 2026, losing $14 million, which by modern cryptocurrency hack standards from exchanges, that's pretty low, like 14 million. But what's very interesting is that at this point, there was very much a fall off of the activity that involved around A7, A5. So I hope that's kind of like enough of the background sort of out there. I think it's a really good point now to talk about the actual reason why we want to talk to here today. Hannah, do you want to walk us through perhaps some of the numbers and what we're seeing going on with A7, A5 today?
Yes, thank you, Nick. So when we look at the headline numbers, you know, there are a few things that are often touted when you read news articles, and they'll either focus on one side of the spectrum, which is to say that, you know, if you look at the market cap of A7, A5, it's $470 million in market cap, which is substantial. It makes it quite a large stablecoin amongst the pack. And, you know, that is still its market cap. And so on one side, the headline indicates that this asset is still quite strong. On the other side, you'll see a lot of reporting that are talking about how, you know, Grinex has gone down, supply has gone down, it's largely dead and dormant. You know, the sanctions activity pretty much killed it off, and, you know, it's nothing really to worry about anymore. When we look at the actual blockchain data and dig into the numbers more deeply into the economics of who's actually using it, how it's circulating, how it's held and distributed, we see a much more clear picture that I'll walk through today. So first of all, our key point here is that it's but not gone. It's essentially the entire supply is still there. It's still on chain. Assuming the reserves are still backing it, this is still a living token. However, when we look at the numbers, we don't see a moving token or a circulating token. It's more hibernating. So first of all, when you look at transfer volumes, either gross transfer volumes, which is simply summing all of the transfers back and forth that happen, or net transfer volumes, where you look at the actual balance changing or position changing movements of the token, that dropped substantially, sharply after Grinex halted in mid-April. So you can see that in the chart here. The volumes, this is looking at monthly net volumes. They're, kind of largely stable, even going up until March, and then dramatically cut down by about half in April, and then far lower ever since then in the months ever since. So that transfer volume has substantially dropped. When we look at the supply concentration for A7A5, it is 94.5% of the Tron supply is in a single operator wallet. The majority of the overall supply is on Tron. There's a bit that's on Ethereum as well. Overall, a little over 99% of the total supply is held in 4 wallets. It's the operator wallets plus the kind of Grinex hacker wallet. So that's the entire supply. It is sitting with the operators and not circulating amongst the others. You might hear reports of about 29,000 addresses that hold the asset, and that is true. You can see in the bar chart here that we have on the side where the 468 million on-chain supply sits. The 29,715 addresses are a sliver of the portion of the activity. It's basically the rest of the 1-ish% of activity that's held across these other addresses, largely dust, essentially. So the money didn't leave when Grinex shut down. The money is still there. It still could be put back into circulation, but right now it is consolidated. So if we look at the next slide, this shows a bit more of that concentration picture. So first of all, looking at how the funds have moved over time, A7A5 has been held in different kind of treasury or operator addresses and switched fairly frequently. So we have kind of a Gantt chart of that activity here of prior treasury addresses and when and how the volume moved. And then what we can see now is the current vault, where the majority, 94.5% of the volume is sitting, was created on May 18th, I believe. It was a few weeks after the Grinex went down. It was created from the same operators that had held the previous volumes, and the funds were essentially swept there, and they're sitting there now ever since then. Here you can see, again, what I was demonstrating about the 29,000 other addresses. The majority of addresses are not these 4 addresses. There are 29,000 other addresses, but 99.2% of the value is in these 4 wallets. Another thing I want to talk about, I mentioned the gross volume versus net transfer volume. So if you were to look at just gross volumes on chain that have been circulating since, in the previous 3 months, it is around a few $1 billion in volume that is circulating. And that is something that, while significantly lower than the amount that was circulating last year, it's still not nothing. So we also wanted to look at, is that real circulation, or is that more churn kind of concentrated amongst a few addresses moving funds back and forth? And so when we looked into that, it is indeed just churn of volume moving back and forth between the same addresses, between these operator wallets, and not an actual kind of distribution even of this lower amount that's happening now. So when you net out that churn, basically 19 cents on every dollar is what we would call kind of real human activity that's happening since then. So it is significantly lower and lower than just, kind of, I think the face value drop doesn't even paint the whole picture of how much lower that activity is actually representing right now. So let's move to the next slide and go a little bit deeper into this. So one of the use cases that is often talked about with an asset that's potentially, being used for sanctions evasion is how much activity is being traded. What are the pairs where A7A5 is being traded with another asset like USDT, so a user can kind of go out from rubles into another fiat currency and be able to use it on chain. So we looked into the trading volumes and found a few things. First of all, in the full history, the trading was really between wrapped A7, A5 and USDT. A very minuscule amounts of USDC and a few other tradings, but that was the main pair. There's also some clear signs of wash trading. So at least the floor is 14.7 million in clear wash trading, just the same addresses sending trading back and forth in the same blocks thousands of times. One address is 46% of the lifetime trading volume, and 7 addresses are about 80 something percent of the total volume. So it's worth, again, one thing that we always talk about is not just looking at the headline numbers or the first numbers that you see about trading volumes, but looking deeper into who's actually trading, how distributed is that, what's the real story going on. So high concentration in overall trading on decentralized exchanges, and that number has gone down. You can see that the majority of the DEX trading actually fell off before that April timeline. So for several months before that, the DEX trading had gone down, and then it continued to fall after the Grinex situation. A lot of this trading was on Uniswap. I think another point that is important to make here, though, is that, looking further into it, we did find that there is a small subset of users who have been trading this whole time. The event in April didn't change their behavior. They're still trading. And, when you look, they'll trade A7, A5 for USDT, and then off onto centralized exchanges to potentially cash out or do something. So, it's worth, I think, it can be distracting to see that there's so much less activity than the headline numbers suggest, but it's also worth keeping in mind that there is activity, and that can represent some real world action, just much lower than what people generally assume. So not a real market, but not a frozen asset either. One other point I want to make is that the reserves, this is actually a yield-bearing asset. So holders of this asset are able to earn a yield, and the asset is meant to appreciate over time. So anybody who is holding it can be a beneficiary of that. And again, with the theme of the kind of parked but not gone, the operators are assuming the reserve is there, are holding onto that reserve and earning the yield on the reserve backing for the asset. So if we look at the next slide here. This breaks down who is actually still using it. As I mentioned, it is much smaller than you might expect, but also not completely dead. So we looked at what's the breakdown of the activity, the transfer volumes that are still flowing. We found that about 50% of that is operator hub to hub, just funds moving from kind of internal cycling. There's some that is hub to wallet, so kind of operator payout or sweep activity. And then about 250 addresses in the last 30 days are human scale addresses with a median transfer of 12,000 among them. And this is, about 1.3% of total supply. So it's minuscule compared to what the overall supply would indicate, but it is, a small amount of real activity that is still happening. And this amounts to about 6 million in genuine kind of human scale flows per month with this asset. And the DEX volume is about less than 1 million per month at the moment. And that number does keep continuing to drop. So the last thing I want to show when we're looking at the on-chain data, and this is on the next slide, this is something, kind of new analysis that we're rolling out where we're actually looking at the rhythm, the kind of clock rhythm of activity, tying that to the world clock, kind of the UTC offset of that activity, looking at, sleeping hours versus waking hours for the active addresses that appear to be human scale. And so we looked at this for the kind of history of the A7, A5 addresses, since currently the users are too small of a sample size. But when we look over the entire history to kind of try to understand where the users were that, that made up the user base of A7, A5, we can see a very kind of clear grouping around the Moscow time zone. So we can see on the map here, kind of the offsets. So this is based on, time zone analysis. So we're able to split the world across. It doesn't tell you, country by country or north versus south kind of groupings of activity. But for an asset that is ruble backed, it's very informative to be able to see, is this concentration really happening around Moscow? Is this like a, kind of focus in that area? Or, we've seen in some reporting that kind of in general, A7 talks about having a user base more in East Asia and other areas. And so at least for the token A7, A5, we're seeing the activity actually concentrating more around the Moscow time zone. This is the share of wallets that are human activity. A lot of activity is more kind of machine always on. And so that we're not tying a location to. But yeah, so this is what we're seeing in the data. We're always happy to kind of go deeper into what we're seeing, but hopefully this paints a picture. To me, the key takeaway is that both sides of the narrative, one, that it's this, massive and really kind of thriving asset is not quite what we see in the data. And then the other side where it's just kind of a dead asset is also not what we're seeing in the data. So
I think the few things I'll take away from this is one is analysis of stablecoins is really important, especially as they're proliferating. There are lots of stablecoins appearing now. And I think that even goes for other sorts of tokens who are used for similar things. We're talking about A7, A5 today, but we could also template this onto ZXian, which I know was used by Babak Sanjani and that sort of service, but also looking at other sort of perhaps like singular purpose, like laundering vehicles, where it's designed basically to be a buffer between a sanctioned asset or a high risk asset and a desirable one like a dollar backed stablecoin. I think there's a lot to learn from there. And it's really interesting, this graph though. This is the first time I've seen this. And what I find really fascinating about this is that the activity is around, basically, Western Russia. And that's particularly interesting. The inauguration of the Vladivostok office of A7, A5 was virtually a virtual ribbon cutting ceremony was attended by the Russian Federation president, Mr. Putin. So that clearly was, as you said, like this idea of a vehicle to try and generate a cross-border payment system for, East Asian, maybe Chinese sort of suppliers or receivers with Russia as a way around it. But patently, it's still centered, or at least the operational control remains inside Moscow. And there's not a retail base at all behind this. And there's clearly not an institutional base. So, I mean, I think like when we're looking for measures of effect or measures of success for this project, I agree with you. Like it's between the two poles of, it's not completely dead, and the house isn't on fire. Don't worry so much. But I think there's another sort of like dynamic to this as well, which is it never got the retail adoption that it purports to do so, which is very interesting when you look at the narratives of the people around it claiming, gross transaction volumes of 190 billion, all this kind of stuff. It's not supported in the data, or it's a deliberate misreading of the data because they know who the audience is going to see it and who's going to pick it up. And I think it's so fascinating that we're able to puncture a lot of this narrative around this way. But this time zone issue is very, very interesting because it really shows that it hasn't landed. Even, in the BRICS region, it doesn't tick any of the BRICS countries particularly. It's mainly focused on a central activity inside Russia. So yeah, I really, really think there's a lot to be said about that. I know there are critiques of time zone inferences with blockchain transactions because of like machines and stuff, but really, if we've got enough users, they'll be in one place. But really, that's genuinely interesting. Like, where do you see though, Hannah, in terms of what would if it was a well adopted sort of, or it was growing adoption, what patterns would you be looking for in this data to show that success was happening? What would you be looking for?
In the time zone data, it does depend on what the goal of the asset is. We do see regional stablecoins like CNGN focused in Nigeria and real-based stablecoins focused in Brazil that are kind of intended to be used in their region. So in that case, I wouldn't see this concentration necessarily as a red flag if it is meant to circulate kind of within users in this area. But as you mentioned, if the stated purpose is more to be this kind of broadly spread asset, then this is clearly showing that it's not meeting that target user base that they're claiming to meet. And then in the larger supply, I would look for less concentration, like more institutions or providers involved to help, let this asset trade, let this asset be used for payments, let this asset be used for, kind of transferring among users. So a broader retail base of, actual holders, a broader base of the kind of the businesses or services or entities that are built around facilitating usage. And, so a larger distribution of how the asset is used. And so right now, we're clearly not seeing that right now, but when we look at the past history, we're also not seeing that. It was much more concentrated, even in its more active days. And so I think, this is something where it probably was vulnerable because of that concentration and because it wasn't actually kind of getting that pickup that it was intended to pick up.
Yeah, I think I remember you described it before as a barbell on the graph, right? You
Yeah.
had like this huge spike of like effectively low level retail activity and then a huge concentration in the whales and like there's nothing in the middle. And I think that's
Yeah.
what is there. And I remember, being asked questions in the past by people saying, oh, is this going to be used for like oil trade? Like, is this going to be them using it to sort of like buy and sell drone components or, weapons or like move, hydrocarbons around the world and pay for it in this token. There's nothing in this data to suggest that's working.
Yeah.
And I think what's also interesting as well, like as this information starts to trickle out of analytics companies, how the issuers of the token, the backers of the token now sort of like started to come up and say, no, 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 we're not gone yet. Like it's still happening. Everything's great. Such intrigue around it, I'm sure. I guess we've kind of had this discussion already, but I mean, like, where do you see on this? Like, I know you're very much like our defender. Like Hannah and I are talking about the nasty attackers of A7 and how we are trying to understand them as a threat. Like, where do you see it as a defender? Not necessarily on the compliance mitigation side, but where do you see it as a problem, just generally speaking? Like, how when you saw A7 being announced, what was your reaction as an MLRO potentially?
Well, I would say that we have some red flags, we have some suspicious indicators, right? So just existence of any token doesn't mean it's illegal, right? Obviously, of course, we should look through it, who is owning. Who was the issuer of the token, what's behind the token, what's the nexus story of the token, right? So that's exactly what you mentioned before, right? So I would say that we should always look at the indicators that I'm going to describe to you in my part as well, why this or that token should be considered as a suspicious one, right? Why we should treat it as a sanction because it's something still new, that the token as a product, as a service being sanctioned, right? It's something, let's say, in the sanction history, never happened before. So I think that's again the lesson we should learn from here, that product and services from the risky point of view should be assessed same level of the scrutiny as the KYC, QIB, or enhanced due diligence.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I know you'll talk about this more in a second, I'm sure, but like I think the emphasis we would say is as you said right there, is inherently A7 or any token to begin with as a piece of code doesn't have problems with it. But what's interesting is the background story. So like when we look at the characters in this story, Ilan Shaw being a very big one, he has a very strong reputation, for being involved with, intrigue around the Russian state amongst other things. I think like that's kind of what's cues everyone to this. And I think that's why, the analysis of the token needs to be coupled with analysis of, well, whose token is it? And I think, yeah, I really love this case study as perhaps the first of its major kind. I think that's also what's interesting at A7. It's like kind of the first time someone's taken a run at it to try and kick out, the private dollar-backed stable coins. Like I think that's what's also interesting at A7 as a concept. It's like, well, do you know what? We're going to make our own private stablecoin, and we're going to use this currency, and we're going to, we're going to be the polar opposite, politically, to yours. But ultimately, they end up relying on the one that they're trying to sort of shut out. And there are so many conversations we can have about like why that might be. Is it too late for somebody else to launch another stablecoin to rival these? Like, how do they win that back? How do you do that? But we haven't got time for that today. We've got plenty to talk about. So, Irina, yeah, I'll leave it with you then. So we've talked about the attack, we've talked about the economics. Like, where do you see A7 from a defensive perspective? Because again, we're looking at now from like trying to protect ourselves against the sort of the issuer or whatever else goes on.
Sure. Just a brief recap, what Nick and Hannah just shown before, right, is particularly important for us as ML and sanction gatekeepers. And the principal trading venue may have disappeared and transaction volumes may have fallen, but the underlying value was not redeemed or removed, right? So it became concentrated in a small number of wallets. What we've seen on the graphs remain technically transferable, retain, and potential. It was the potential to migrate into new infrastructure, what exactly happened. So the findings also show several indicators that are directly relevant to an AML and sanction control framework. Significant concentration of supply under parent common control. Also movement into newly created wallets, right? Why it's important to identify and recognize unhosted wallet risks, right? After restrictions or operational disruption, repeated replacement of operational wallet infrastructure, what we've seen also on-chain, operator-driven or circular activity rather than genuine independent demand. Also conversion from A7, A5 into a more widely accepted stablecoin, what we see on the graph as well, USDT. Also some potential movement from crypto conversion into conversional payment channels, including card spendings, and we're going to talk about this just a bit later. So the key lesson is that decrease in activity at known address doesn't necessarily mean that the financial crime risk has disappeared. So it may mean that value has been parked, right? And in the infrastructure actually has migrated or conversion road has changed. So let's speak about why static control is not enough, right? Why we should still keep going, ongoing screening. And what we see here is one of the principal limitations of static wallet screening, and screening on sanction addresses remain necessarily, but it's not sufficient. So after a designation, an operator may empty identified wallets, create new collection and distributed addresses, change counterparties, move to another blockchain or token, and establish a new conversion road. So there are different sanction circumvention techniques, right? What we see also on chain. And newly created wallets may have no adverse history, but an empty history does not demonstrate independence or legitimacy. So compliance teams must look for continuity between the old and new infrastructure. And relevant indicators, if we speak about indicators here, include fundings from previously attributed wallets, coordinated wallet creation, also rapid sweeping of balances, also common gas funding sources, identical transaction timing, what Hannah mentioned, right? Repeated counterparties and reuse of the same liquidity roads. So there is no single indicator that absolutely proves common control, but several coordinated indicators may provide reasonable grounds to conclude that infrastructure has actually migrated rather than disappeared. So this is why the unit of risk cannot be only individual address, right? It must include designated entity, also ownership and control, associated wallet cluster, the service and its counterparties, recurring operational behavior. Compliance principle is important here. Sanction apply to persons, ownership, control, and prohibited dealings, not only to the wallet address, right? Known to the date of designation. So it's let's say it's always dynamic process. So when a known address becomes inactive, the correct response is not simply to close the alert. The institution should determine whether the activity has stopped or it is moved elsewhere. So once we understand this wallet rotation, the next step is to classify the institution's exposure. Direct token exposure exists when the customer sends, received, holds, or convert A5, A7, A5. Also, immediate conversion exposure exists when USDT or another asset is received directly following an A7, A5 conversion. Cluster exposure arises when a new wallet is financially or behaviorally connected to previously identified infrastructure. So indirect exposure exists where funds pass through one or more intermediaries, which happening actually quite frequently before reaching the institution, another step, another layer. These categories are not automatically legally equivalent, so the assessment should consider proximity to the designated infrastructure, timing, value and direction of the transfer, ownership and control, customer knowledge, economic purpose. So something which is taken from Tradify, right? All the knowledge, but specific sanction prohibition that applies as well. So a direct A7, A5 to USDT conversion is different from a small and remote historical exposure several transactions away. The compliance decision should therefore be proportionate and evidence-led and jurisdiction-specific, right? So the DEX leg is particularly important, and use of DEX is not inherently suspicious, right? The similar way as creation and issuing of the token, but it creates a potential information gap for the compliance. So there may be no central intermediary, right, conducting customer due diligence, and this is well known as well for the criminals, for the sanction evasion techniques that collecting travel rule data. So there is no collection of the travel rule data, establishing the transaction purpose or identifying the wallet owner. This is all either there is a gap about that or there is absence of those procedures. So DEX is the layer, and institution should reconstruct the complete transaction, token in, liquidity pool and router, token out, and destination wallet. It should determine which token was supplied, who initiated the swap, who provided the liquidity, where the output asset moved, and whether the transaction changed an independent party's economic position. So high transaction volumes alone does not prove a genuine market. Mirror image trades, circular movements, also rapid back and forth transfers, or one wallet accounting for most activity may indicate also wash trading or operator controlled activity. With that, we are going to the next slide, where I just give you one example, just to understand what kind of steps we can take if we have, let's say, if you have the example that there is final merchant sees an ordinary card payment. So the card issuer may see a stablecoin funded account, but the original value may have passed through. So the scenario of A7, A5 is converted into USDT, right? An unhosted wallet holds A7, A5, converts it into USDT through a DEX, and then sends this USDT to a regulated exchange, payment provider, or crypto card account, as I mentioned before. So a basic control may ask only, is the depositing wallet listed, and is USDT prohibited or sanctioned? If both answers are no, the transaction may pass, but conversion changes the assets, not its provenance. And the compliance review should establish whether the USDT came directly from an A7, A5 conversion, whether the customer controls the relevant unhosted wallet, if we speak about the travel rule, whether the wallets are connected to sanctioned entities or previously identified clusters, whether the transaction represents genuine conversion, pass-through activity or circular trading, how quickly the USDT was deposited, withdrawn, or spent. So the timing as well is important for the analysis. Whether the customer can demonstrate economic purpose and source of the funds, which is reasonable and consistent with the profile of the client. As well, the sanction assessment must determine whether the transaction involves prohibited dealing, designated person, ownership and control collection, or potential circumvention. And separately, the AML assessment should consider whether there are indicators of layering, third-party activity, or transaction consistent with the customer profile. So depending on the findings, right, there are steps that can be taken to identify the original token, right? Step 1, confirm whether the wallet previously received or held a 7A5, including correct token contract, blockchain involved, any wrapped version, amount received, source wallets, time between receipt and conversion. We also have to identify the swap, right? If DEX or swap service appeared, pool and voter contracts, also liquidity providers, slippage, transaction timing, connected wallets. Step 3 can be we have to trace the output assets, right? We should confirm which wallet received the USDT, whether it was the same customer-controlled wallet, how quickly USDT reached the regulated institution, whether it passed through additional wallets, whether it was divided among several accounts, whether it was forwarded to another VASP, OTC service, or card-linked wallet. Step 4 can be understand the customer and purpose, right? Our basic and classic KYC procedure. Step 5, take the required actions, right? So depending on the facts and applicable laws, the response may include suspending automated processing, holding the transaction, freezing assets or blocking the account, also filing suspicious activity report. Right, so this is just an example how we can look through the whole array layering technique, including DEX. Right, so this is what I mentioned, right? So if we have in the path a crypto link card, right? So the flow may be A7, A5 going to the unhosted wallet. There is a DEX conversion to USDT. Also, after USDT, it goes to the card account and fiat conversion, right? And as a final step, there is a merchant or crypto ATM, right? So, sorry, not crypto, but fiat ATM. So each participant may see only one part of the transaction. And for example, merchant sees the ordinary card payment. The acquiring institution, they see fiat settlement. The card program may see a USDT deposit, but may not see that the USDT was received directly from converting A7, A5. So this creates a significant monitoring gap for the compliance teams. And conversion into a widely accepted stablecoin, which is USDT, does not erase the origin of the economic value. It may simply prevent token only or immediate address screening from detecting it. In this particular case, how we can identify, right, that something was wrong before it actually came into the fiat, right? So card finding immediately following an A7, A5 to USDT conversion, right? Deposit from newly created or frequently changing wallets. Also, rapid spending or ATM withdrawals. Several cardholders funded from common wallets. Transaction splitting below monitoring threshold, right? Activity inconsistent with the customer profile, classic. No credible explanation for the conversion and cash out road. Effective control that should therefore cover unhosted wallet, finding wallet, proof of wallet ownership or control, right? Conversion transaction, source of the USDT, connection to the designated entities or clusters. and subsequent card settlement and cash out activity. So the key message of including a crypto card payment institution, that the exposure survives in the funding chain even when it is no longer visible in the final payment record. Where the facts indicate a potential sanctions nexus, the institution must conduct the applicable sanction assessment, right? Separately, unexplained conversion, layering, or third-party funding, or rapid cash out may create grounds for enhanced due diligence and possible SARS reporting for compliance teams. This brings us to the final and perhaps the most interesting point, and this is in particular a big difference with the TradFi world. When a company is sanctioned, right? Normally it means that a company cannot exist, right? And when a sanctioned entity becomes dormant, right, in crypto world, and its known on-chain cluster stops moving, that is not necessarily the end of the investigation, right? The end of the story. It may be the beginning of the next stage of sanction circumvention. And dormant operator may be parking funds, creating replacement wallets, testing new conversion roads, moving to another blockchain or token, searching for a successor venue. So preparing to re-enter through intermediaries, OTC services, also payment cards, and the absence of activity at known address may mean only that the visible infrastructure has changed, and monitoring should therefore shift from known addresses to migration patterns, right? So for compliance teams in crypto, it should trigger the enhanced due diligence, right? What is happening with the sanction entity? From a static cluster to a successes infrastructure monitoring, from the last node road to emerging conversion and cash out channels. So dormancy is relevant, but it should not automatically be interpreted as successful disruption. And compliance team should look for renewed activity involving newly funded wallets, replacement token, contracts, common counterparties, new liquidity pools, and conversion into more widely accepted assets. And let's say my final message from these slides, dormant sanction cluster is not necessarily a closed case. It is the point at which monitoring must change shape from observing known infrastructure to detecting how that infrastructure may return.
Irina, I think I made loads of notes on what you said. I think, Hannah, I think you can probably help with this question too. So I think one of the big takeaways I got here was substance of the transaction is important, right? And we know that from general compliance. We need to know like who the customer is, why they're doing what they're doing. We need to understand the purpose, the economic purpose of what they're doing. And like usually whenever I've seen compliance cases where it's been like come up as wrong, it's usually down to they didn't really know enough about their customer. They didn't really know enough about that transaction. That's usually the slippery slope. But what you also stumbled upon, I think, is in this case, and Hannah, you've really helped to illuminate this, is the substance of the token. And it's the substance of the token off chain, as in like who is it, who runs this, who are those people behind it, but also the on-chain substance. Is it wash traded? And we could delete A7 from a sanctions risk and insert another token for a fraud or something else that's nefarious around it. And I think being able to do these kind of analysis is very important. You need to be able to sit down and look at the economics of a stablecoin, not just from like a risk, like a financial risk perspective, for an ML risk perspective in crypto, which is a really different dynamic, I think, what most people are talking about, because most of the time we're happy with the instrument that's being used. It's a ruble, don't use it. It's a euro, that's fine. That's a simple distinction we can make. But I think what you both highlighted really to me is that we need to look at the substance of the token, not just as a product on chain, but also the people in the company who stand behind it and who they are. And I think A7 is kind of an easy case, let's be honest. It's very public, very publicly associated with the ruble, therefore Russia. The people around it were very notorious. There are lots of things that we can sort of take away as data points and go, yes, that's a big red flag, don't go near it. That's clear. But I think we start getting into now the more difficult elements of sanctions evasion or, risk where we've got to try and look through or find things that aren't necessarily so publicly associated with that kind of high receptivity. And I think like what we've got here is a whole list of markers that you need to be able to do as a team. And as a compliance staff, you may be normally carrying the weight in AML risk. You might be happy every day to sort of say, oh, that's a flag, it's from a sanctioned country or it's from a drug dealer, whatever else, like we can close that one off. But actually, what we need to do now is we need to get alongside our other risk departments, the people who look at the assets that my exchange is carrying or receiving, or accepts that my client has interacted with for the safety of the transaction. So I think that's really, really, really important. I was going to circle back to another point, and it's very timely because FATF have recently issued a paper on it about decentralized exchanges and DeFis. Um, Hannah, you mentioned that they used Uniswap, or at least Uniswap's infrastructure, which I understand is a permissionless DEX, right? Anybody can list something on a permissionless DEX and swap the token, which I think introduces a whole number of problems. Even if the front end, let's say, is configured to prevent that activity happening, if anyone can list a token, you can just create a million new contracts every time they shut down the first one. Hannah, what do you see as other risks around permissionless DEXs within this sort of thing?
Yeah, so you make a really good point, which is that the front end, the UI of a DEX could delist a token. And so, that can mean that a user using the front end may not see that it's available to trade. But the permissionless DEX, like that doesn't prevent the trading from happening and from being set up on the back end. The other thing too is in the case of A7A5, it was the wrapped A7A5 token, which is a different contract address, a different token name. So if you're simply screening for A7A5, then you would miss the WA7A5, the wrapped A7A5. So you got to kind of keep track and stay on top of which assets are involved and which ones may represent what you're looking for, but not actually be what you had on your radar to look for. So yeah, so basically what you want to do is make sure you have a comprehensive kind of view of the assets that are in circulation or being used alongside of the main asset. Oftentimes with stable coins, there will be the yield-bearing version of a stable coin. So like in a non-sanctioned example, you have USDS, and then there's savings USDS, which is SUSDS, or staked USDS, which is staked. So there's these assets kind of come in bundles that you want to keep an eye on. And then once you have that, like look at the macro view of the trading that's happening and who's involved, which chains it's happening on, and keeping that broad view of the contract addresses that you're watching out for these tokens across chains too, and over time because those change. So yeah, the DEX volumes can be happening much more broadly than what you're assuming, and keeping an eye on which platforms that's happening on, despite regardless of whether they're kind of supposedly like not listed or delisted from a UI.
Yeah, I think again it's also a key point. Again, you've said definitely for me it's important, which is not all DEXs are created equal, right? And permissionless ones may be a higher level risk. And I think what's also we keep circling back to is that the venue of conversion. I mean, you talked a lot about this. Like the venue of conversion is really important. This is definitely Crystal's kind of like data philosophy, right? It's like we know that there can be a million new tokens made. We know that there can be a million new, transactions tomorrow. But really, what's important is the conversion layer. Like, where do you take your A7 and turn it into USDT, and where do you take USDT and turn that into something that you can use? Like, where does that chain happen? And I think that's really the emphasis I see here too, which is that conversion layer. And what I think is also more vulnerable in this sector are decentralized services because they don't have the same listing checks and balances as a centralized exchange might do. There's not necessarily anything inherently wrong with that approach, but it does leave them more at risk. And certainly, if I was building a compliance framework around, interacting with DeFi, I would be very, very interested in understanding their listing and their permissions process, especially if it's permissionless, because you open yourself up to, potentially these kind of problems. Even if it's taken from a UI, if it's permissionless, you can still use it in the back end and transact as you like. So much inside this sort of session, and I know we've sort of like hit up for time, and I think there's so many other things to talk about, like because this is really I think this is like the future. And I think this kind of like people talk about, well, what does a compliance officer look like in 2026? And it's generally something, something, something AI. I think this is more broad than that. I think it's you need to understand a lot more than just a very narrow subset of indicators. You need to understand very broadly, simple macroeconomic things to understand. You need to understand an ecosystem around the token. It's not sufficient anymore, really, to make decisions on transactions if you don't understand the whole breadth of an ecosystem, that the risks that you're facing. And I think also many exchanges list a huge amount of tokens very, very quickly, right? They want to give the most products to their customers. They want the most stuff that's going on there. Does this kind of suggest that maybe there needs to be some walking back of this, a limited number of services, a limited number of tokens, so you can really dig into the weeds of what's going on there because of the scaling sort of problem inside that? Uh, I guess that's us for 56 minutes. Like, again, it went very, very quickly because I think there's so much to talk about in this topic. Irina, I'll turn to you first. Like, do you have any final comments or thoughts? Anything that stood out to you from A7 or just stablecoin compliance generally after this case? Because it's such a useful thing to talk about other issues. Like, what does it stand out to you? What's the main sort of thing you'd want people to remember?
Sure, yeah, it's obviously it's endless topic, right? And it's only one example with a 75, but what the main and the final compliance takeaway, right? That it's always a combination of off-chain data, right? Who is behind the token, and also on-chain data, right? So how to spot this high-risk token, and it's rarely identified by one red flag alone, right? So we need to assess who control it, how concentrated its supply is, whether its trading activity is genuine, what reserves support it, and where it can be converted or cashed out. When a PAC or sanction control, right, what exactly in this case happened, artificial volume, wallet rotation, and weakly regulated conversion routes appear together. If we speak about combination of the indicators, so enhanced scrutiny and continuous monitoring are essential here. Also from the stablecoin issuer level, right? Because we understand that stablecoin issuer here in European Union, they have to obtain MiCA license, right? Which is happening since July last year. So, and as well, what we should remember as well about sanction entities and the difference from the fiat world, that dormancy does not necessarily mean the risk has disappeared, right? It may indicate that the infrastructure is appearing in another infrastructure and preparing to migrate or circumvent sanctions through a new road.
Brilliant. Thanks, Irina. Hannah, any final remarks from you?
Honestly, Irina nailed it. All the things I was thinking about saying, she captured. So I think that's a great wrap
Yeah.
up.
Sandwiches fully stolen. And I think I have one sort of final remark is, and it really is parked but not gone. I think that's what I look at this is. When we talk about A7, A5, we want to do a victory lap too. We want to say that the impact of sanctions, comprehensive sanctions by three major, bodies, the EU, the UK, and the and OFAC, had such a high degree of success in paralyzing A7, A5. I'd love to say that's like the clean bill of health, but I think the reality, as you said, is way more nuanced than that. And I think on A7, A5 side, and maybe perhaps, what we could say to any potential stablecoin issue in the future is, Kevin Costner, Field of Dreams logic, if you build it, they will come, isn't necessarily the reality when it comes to a stablecoin product. You really need to have more than just one or two issuing venues for it to be sort of picked up and run with. And the market is dominated and the market is tough in stablecoins. And just because you make a little noise on it doesn't mean it's going to catch on like you want it to. Listen, we have gone to the full hour, so I'm really, really happy with that. Thank you both so much for your time today. It's been absolutely enlightening. I'm gonna go away and read 1,000 things more about A7 and macroeconomics now, Hannah. You've now given me another thing I've got to go and sit and read, but really worth it. Thank you very much for your time, and to all of you who listened today, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking, and yeah, we'll see you next time. Thank you. Goodbye.